COVID-19. Agradecemos a todos los líderes y personal técnico de las autoridades reguladoras, de los Ministerios de Salud, colegas expertos que están asistiendo a esta 10ª conferencia. Les agradecemos a todos los panelistas su presencia y su contribución, y especialmente queremos agradecer a quien va a presidir esta sesión, que es la doctora María Antonieta Gamarra. La doctora Gamarra es química farmacéutica de la Universidad Nacional de Asunción, especialista en administración hospitalaria y en salud pública, con certificación del programa de líderes internacionales de la OPS. Ha sido directora general de Relaciones Internacionales del Ministerio de Salud Pública y Bienestar Social de 2013 a 2020 y directora general de la Dirección Nacional de Vigilancia Sanitaria en distintos periodos y actualmente desde abril hasta la actualidad. Así que, doctora Gamarra, bienvenida, un gusto que esté presidiendo esta sesión y le damos la palabra.
Doctora María Gamarra, estás en mute.
Perdón. Muy buenos días a todos. Gracias, José Luis. Bienvenidos a la segunda sesión plenaria de la 10ª conferencia de la Red PARF. Iniciamos la sesión La contribución de los sistemas regulatorios de la región de las Américas a la respuesta de la pandemia por COVID-19, en la cual se discutirán temas relacionados con la implementación de eficiencias regulatorias, así como también los desafíos y estrategias en áreas específicas de la emergencia. Paso ahora la palabra a la doctora Elizabeth Hilbrenner, directora asociada de programas científicos y regulatorios del Centro de Dispositivos y Salud Radiológica de la Administración de Alimentos y Medicamentos de Estados Unidos, oradora destacada de esta sesión. Doctora Elizabeth, por favor, si puede abrir su micrófono, y usted tiene 15 minutos.
Good morning. It's a real pleasure to be with you. Thank you for having me this morning. I'm looking forward to sharing our experience in the United States with the use of emergency use authorization authorities for medical devices. So our authority for emergency use authorization is given to the FDA commissioner when the Secretary of the Health and Human Services declares a public health emergency or a significant potential for a public health emergency. And in the case of the COVID-19 pandemic, this declaration was made on February 4th, 2020. And that opens up this pathway whereby the commissioner of the FDA can temporarily authorize under the emergency use pathway, medical products to address, whether it's to diagnose, treat, or prevent a serious or life-threatening disease or condition that is caused by chemical, biological, radiological, or a nuclear threat agent, in this case, an emerging infectious disease. When the secretary goes, when the agency goes to consider a request for emergency use authorization, the things that we need to consider include whether the disease or condition caused by the agent is serious or life-threatening, whether the particular product may be effective to diagnose, prevent, or treat the condition. Now, this threshold, may be effective, is very different than our standard pathways, where in a standard pre-market review pathway for a medical device, we're looking at whether the product is safe and effective, whereby in the EUA process, we're looking at whether it may be effective. So along these lines, we consider the known and potential benefits and whether they outweigh the known and potential risks. This is a trade-off. You're looking at less data compared to what you would see in a standard pathway. And the trade-off is that you can bring products to market faster when they're urgently needed, but but you're relying on less evidence. And we saw in some cases where later, as we learned more about certain products, we realized that we needed to make adjustments, that initial decision needed to be adjusted. Another thing that we have to consider when we're looking at an emergency use authorization request is whether there's an adequate, approved, or available alternative. So in some cases, we do issue EUAs when there are insufficient supplies of the alternative. So there is an alternative, it exists, just not in sufficient quantity. So from our center, the Center for Devices, our role in COVID-19 was really to facilitate the availability and access to medical devices through the EUA process, and also by engaging with the stakeholders in the device community, help them along. Sometimes we had stakeholders that were, or developers who were new to regulatory, new to FDA, new to making devices. And so they weren't familiar with our processes. And we tried to help them appropriately develop their products and come through the regulatory process in a smooth way. Now, we applied the EUA authority to requests for a wide variety of devices. Of course, tests were the first out of the gate, as they typically are in emerging outbreaks. But we also used our EUA authorities to authorize various types of devices for personal protection, ventilators and respiratory assist devices, circulatory support, products for dialysis, and then a variety of remote monitoring devices to enable healthcare to facilitate healthcare without so much direct interaction, putting folks at risk. Another thing we did was, I mentioned that the authority calls for us to consider the known and potential benefits and the known and potential risks. Well, those can change over the course of an outbreak, right? So as the situation on the ground was evolving, as we were learning more about science, we had to take that all into consideration on an iterative basis and continue to adapt our policies as appropriate as those circumstances changed. And I've included a link here for those who are interested in seeing the products that we have authorized for COVID-19. Now, this is a snapshot of the workload that we have seen in the US Center for Devices related to COVID. And I'll just flag that at a high level, it's just an incredible volume of work, 38% overall increase in workload in 2020. Now, this includes over 3,000 EUA requests, another almost 1,000 supplements. A supplement to an EUA request might be to add another use for a device. For example, you might have a test for diagnosing patients suspected of COVID-19, and then the developer does another study and shows that it can be used for screening asymptomatic individuals. That would be a supplement. We also have a pre-EUA process where we've received over 2,500 requests. And that's a way for us to sort of review on a rolling basis the data as it's generated by a developer. So they might complete one study, we look at it through the pre-EUA while they're continuing their validation. And then when their last set of data comes in, we're able to move very quickly on that final authorization. Now, when it comes to what we've actually authorized, we have over 400 IVDs, diagnostics that have been authorized under the EUA process, over 200 personal protective equipment products, over 100 ventilators, and over 50 other products. In total, when you add these up with the submissions that have come in through the standard pathways, like 510K for us, we have authorized over 1,900 medical devices to address the COVID pandemic so far. Now, this workload, of course, is huge for us, and it is really the equivalent of over 360 people, or 20% of our workforce, working full-time for a year. So it has had a tremendous impact on our center. A hallmark of what makes this work is communication and engagement with all of our stakeholders. I mentioned the pre-EUAs, where that's a one-on-one interaction with an individual developer. The same thing goes for, we set up a toll-free number and email boxes where we could have one-on-one conversations and interactions with developers of medical devices. And that works pretty well, and especially in the beginning of the pandemic. It's very fruitful having those interactions. It can really speed development and products to market. However, with the tsunami of EUA requests, we had to come up with some creative ways to engage the community more broadly because we didn't have the resources to continue that level of one-on-one engagement. So some of the things we came up with are posting a frequently asked questions on our website. We post templates, EUA templates for different types of submissions. So you might have templates for different types of diagnostic tests, including home tests, antibody tests, ventilators, surgical masks. And these are sort of fill in the blank forms to really facilitate a developer validating their product and bringing it through the regulatory process. We also instituted virtual town halls and webinars. I think we just did our 74th town hall on tests, and we've done some on other products as well. And we have issued over 28 guidance documents and 17 revisions. And those revisions really reflect what I was saying about keeping up with the evolving nature of the pandemic and the state of knowledge of the science behind these products. And so we update the guidances as appropriate as we go on. Now, another hallmark of our response to COVID-19 has been using flexibility and innovation in the EUA process. This authority is general. The concept of may be effective, and considering the known and potential benefits and the known and potential risks gives us some room to exercise innovation in how we apply it. And so one thing we came up with new in this particular outbreak is the concept of an umbrella EUA. Now, an umbrella EUA is for multiple devices of the same type that meet the same criteria. So what we do is we authorize all devices that meet X, Y, and Z criteria. And then a developer who has a product that meets those sends us their information to support that. And if it actually does need it, then we add them to an appendix of that umbrella. Now, what this does is it really streamlines a lot of the paperwork. It does not change the science. It does not change our confidence level in a particular product, just streamlines the process for getting it through to authorization. Now, another thing I mentioned, the 28 guidance documents and 17 revisions. Now, these documents offer various types of regulatory flexibility tailored to different product areas based on the needs of the pandemic at any given time. So in the case of tests, for example, we came up with a notification policy in the beginning of the pandemic that allowed certain developers to begin using their tests once they were validated, and they notify us, just an email saying, I validated my test, ready to go, and then follow up with an EUA later. Other policies include flexibility around modifications to existing products and flexibility around adding sort of remote monitoring capabilities to existing products. A wide range of different flexibilities were introduced, tailored to a given situation through these 28 guidance documents. Another thing we've done, and we've done this in past outbreaks as well, is development of a reference panel for the molecular diagnostics. Now, I mentioned the trade-off in the bar for coming to market, and we get minimal data necessary for the EUA. Now, this idea of sending out a reference panel post-market allows us to double check, does the test really work? And then it also gives us a benchmark that all the different tests can be evaluated against so that you can compare relative performance. Something novel we've done in this outbreak is partner with the NIH to conduct independent evaluations of the tests themselves. Now, where the reference panel is, we're sending the material to the developer and having them evaluate their performance blindly. In these partnerships with NIH, the developer is sending their test to the NIH, and the NIH is evaluating First, we had a program for serology tests, and now we're setting up a program that's actually in place for antigen tests. This is something that, other countries have been doing. We have been in touch with other countries, particularly in Europe, have established similar programs for antigen tests where they evaluate them themselves. When it comes to the post-market side of things, we keep a close eye, especially as the variants are emerging. When it comes to tests, there's a potential that their performance could be impacted by emerging variants. And so we have conditions of authorization that developers monitor for emerging variants and model whether the targets of their tests could be impacted by those variants. We do our own modeling as well. And we follow that very closely. We also monitor adverse events and other information. And when appropriate, we'll issue a warning letter. We've done 49 of those. In some cases, we even revoke an EUA. Now, this could be because of that trade-off I mentioned, where in the post-market space, we realize that a test is not performing or another product is not performing at a level that we think it should, or that other authorized products are performing at, and so it makes sense to revoke it. In the case of PPE, when the shortages were really dire, we had actually authorized decontamination systems, but then as the circumstances changed, they were no longer necessary, so then we revoked them. We've also had some products recalled, and I mentioned the test notification policy. In some cases where we've found problems with tests, sometimes through the NIH evaluation program, we have removed the tests from the notification list. And then we've also issued 29 letters to healthcare providers, and this just is to share information as we're learning it. We think that transparency to the community is just crucial as we work our way through this pandemic. So in closing, I wanted to just highlight our two key lessons learned. I mean, I could talk all day about our lessons learned because there are so many, but I would like to highlight the value of regulatory flexibility, being able to adapt as the situation changes, as we learn more about the science, and also the power of engagement. This ability to interact with the developers, help them with the regulatory process, work together. The combination of these two things is really like the secret sauce that helps us bring medical devices to the United States that are needed, and have been successful in bringing over 1,900 new devices for COVID-19 to the market here. So those are the two key things that I think I would like folks to take away, is the flexibility and the power of engagement. So with that, I'd just like to thank you so much for inviting me to share our experience with you.
Muchas gracias, doctora Elizabeth, por su intervención. Interesante presentación, creo que la compartimos todos. Desde nuestras agencias regulatorias hemos pasado por situaciones muy similares a esta experiencia que usted presentó. Empecemos ahora la sesión del panel, que será guiado por el moderador Mac Lamping, subdirector de Desarrollo Integrado y líder de iniciativas de sistemas regulatorios globales de la Fundación Bill y Melinda Gates. Nos acompañan a esta sesión los siguientes panelistas que voy a presentar. Daniel Rodríguez, director de gestión de adquisiciones y suministros de la OPS-OMS. María Margarita Jaramillo, jefa de oficina asesora jurídica del Instituto de Vigilancia de Medicamentos y Alimentos Nacional de Colombia. Alejandro Svarch, comisionado federal de la Comisión Federal para la Protección contra Riesgos Sanitarios de México. El doctor Hichi Silo, jefe de la Unidad de Regulación y Precalificación de la OMS. Penelope Lankis, jefe del Centro Colaborador de la OMS para Vigilancia Farmacológica Internacional. Ron Pierre-Viensi, director de la Farmacopea de los Estados Unidos, y Herbert Lelutier, director ejecutivo del Centro de Monitoreo de Uppsala. Le paso ahora la palabra a Mac y le agradezco muchísimo que mantengan la discusión hasta las 10:45 AM, por favor. Adelante, Mac.
Gracias, Dr. Gamara. Bom dia, bonjour, buenos dias, good morning, everyone. And I welcome all of you to this session, and I want to thank you again for joining us for this panel discussion today. Personally, I'm very delighted and honored to be moderating this panel discussion with this distinguished group of colleagues. And let me express my thanks to them at this time for taking time to join us. I think a special word of thanks is needed for our friend Hiti Silo, who has joined us this morning literally at the very last minute, as Mariangela Chamau had an unexpected emergency in Geneva. So Hiti, a very special thank you to you. Now, I'm going to try to share my screen here. Let's see if I'm capable of doing this. I think so. And as you know, this panel today will focus on the contributions of and challenges to the regulatory systems in the Americas to the response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So let's take just a couple of minutes to try to set the scene. I think all of us who are involved in healthcare realize, hopefully, that if one is going to have a quality healthcare system, there are three fundamental components to that system. One, obviously, is you have to have quality practitioners. You have to have quality facilities in which for these practitioners to practice, and you have to have access to quality healthcare products. If any one of these three legs to this stool does not exist, even if the other two legs are world-class, one does not have a quality healthcare system. And when it comes to assuring that on a given market, that the healthcare products that are available to the practitioners and to the patients are indeed quality products that they can depend on, that is the job of the regulatory systems. So when we look at our regulatory systems around the world, we always have to give the message, they are not a distinct separate group doing something off to the side. They are a critical component to any quality healthcare system. And in the pandemic, I think one of the first things we learned was that the mission of these regulatory agencies did not change. They were still there, even more importantly, to assure that medical products were available to address the pandemic, but that these products were indeed safe, effective, and manufactured in an acceptable quality manner so that they could be these critical components of a quality healthcare system trying to address the pandemic. But as we all know, this unfolded extremely quickly, and it gave us all the challenges of extraordinary unknowns with public health imperatives and economic health imperatives that grew stronger and stronger every day. We knew this was a new agent that was causing the pandemic, about which very little was known. There were large numbers of people dying around the world, and no one was sure how to stop it. And economies were crashing around the world. All of this adding to a sense of panic and to a feeling that timeliness was of the essence. So there were many strategic challenges to regulators that this panic and this pandemic brought at the very beginning. One was, how do you stay scientifically robust? How do you not cut corners when everyone is asking you to do it? Because you realize if you're not scientifically robust, you're just guessing as to what the efficacy, the safety, and the quality are, and whether the product is going to do any good or even potentially do any good. One of the biggest challenges was trying to figure out, I mean, it's a challenge in normal times, but in the pandemic, trying to figure out what is your community's tolerance to the risk of the unknown about a product versus the known devastation that was going on because of the infection. And trying to figure out, as Elizabeth was just describing, how do you figure out whether there is a demonstrated positive benefit risk profile under the circumstances upon which to base an authorization when you have incomplete data? How do you become procedurally flexible to enhance timeliness of decision-making by perhaps eliminating redundancy, relying on other authorities to help you define and make your own decision, and what regulatory pathways are available to you to address this pandemic? And if there aren't any, are there pathways like Elizabeth was describing that they did that you could legitimately create to help address the pandemic? And then finally, the issue of communication, and how do you as a regulator communicate forthrightly to inform the public each step of the way, even when it's things the public and the media and your political bosses don't want to hear? Because at the end of the day, the trust of the regulator by all stakeholders will be critical to a successful response. If the regulator loses the trust of its stakeholders, then it loses the ability to be a critical player in helping the healthcare system and the overall political system respond to the pandemic. There were also operational challenges for the regulators. How do you develop the needed scientific efficacy and data on products in the midst of this kind of pandemic situation? I think, as many of the regulators will attest, they were overwhelmed by numerous clinical trial applications, many of which were not designed or powered to even be informative. And they were trying to exist in a world where there was basically science by press release in a never-ending 24-hour news cycle. There was unprecedented political pressure and public statements on the benefit-risk profile of various products being made by people that basically undermined the regulatory authorities' responsibilities and the messages they should have been giving to their people. In looking at how to best use the resources that one has, as Elizabeth pointed out, even an agency as well-resourced as the US FDA was overwhelmed by the numbers of applications and the issues with which they had to deal. So how can you decide if there are other agencies that you can rely on to inform your own decision? And how do you decide which ones you can? And then if you do that, how can you be assured that you're getting the same version of the product that your reference agency reviewed? And then how do you, going back to this very critical issue of communication, express uncertainty in a world that is clamoring for certainty? And how do you prepare your people for the inevitable new information that will keep coming in this very scientifically iterative process and will change, as Elizabeth pointed out in several examples, your regulatory perspective as you learn more over time? It's a very different regulatory paradigm that one is using here, and how you communicate that and how you prepare your people and your politicians and your healthcare systems for regulatory decisions that will be iterative and will be changing as more information is developed over time. These are all strategic and operational challenges that regulators were forced to address. And we do have an incredibly distinguished panel of colleagues today. They have been introduced to you. You see their names here. And what we're going to do now is go through a series of questions related to many of these strategic and operational challenges and hear directly from these people who had to make decisions in the midst of this environment and this ecosystem, and hear how they tried to approach it. We have a lot of questions to get to. I'm going to start sharing my screen here. That was my last slide. And I would like to first start with our regulators from Colombia and from Mexico. And this is the question. And why don't we start with you, Maria Margarita. And the question is, going back to this ecosystem that I was trying to describe, you know, access to healthcare products really became a challenge for all countries, as I'm sure it was for you all there in Colombia. And you were responsible for doing this benefit risk profile decision, often on products that were coming from outside of Colombia, often from products that were coming from countries that we know do not have a very strong regulatory system. But yet the pressure was increasing, both in the press and in the political system, and the patients saying, we need something. And you were having to kind of juggle this issue of the demand for products versus your knowledge of incomplete or weak evidence. And so how did you try to approach this there in Colombia to meet these different demands? Over to you. Thank you.
Gracias. Bueno, en Colombia hicimos muchas cosas desde que empezó la emergencia, desde que se declaró la emergencia sanitaria en Colombia. Nos adelantamos a prever que hubiera un desabastecimiento de productos y empezamos a crear unos listados muy amplios de vitales no disponibles que incluían no solo medicamentos, sino dispositivos médicos, productos cosméticos, productos de higiene. Antes de que escasearan en el mercado, creamos esto para poder facilitar su autorización de importación sin registro sanitario, pero cumpliendo con una autorización y con unos requisitos mínimos, con una autorización de otras agencias de referencia. También acompañamos mucho a la industria nacional, lo mismo que comentaba la delegada de la FDA. Acompañamos a la industria nacional en varias innovaciones, tratando de que entendieran los procedimientos del INVIMA y pudieran continuar con esas innovaciones, particularmente en respiradores y ventiladores mecánicos. También tuvimos ensayos clínicos, incrementaron muchas solicitudes de ensayos clínicos, se mejoraron los tiempos, flexibilizamos requisitos, adelantamos los procedimientos lo más rápido posible y también contamos con una figura desde finales del año 2020, una figura de autorización de uso de emergencia, como la tienen otros países, para poder empezar a aceptar el uso de las vacunas en la fase en que estaban, de una forma segura, que pudiéramos verificar la información disponible en calidad, seguridad y eficacia y hacer una evaluación riesgo-beneficio favorable para la población. Incluso esa autorización de uso de emergencia en junio de 2021 tuvo otra regulación normativa que permite que esas autorizaciones de emergencia sean actualizadas y modificadas tanto por solicitud del gobierno a través del Ministerio de Salud como de su propio titular. Entonces, eso nos permite que la figura siga siendo muy dinámica, muy actual y que se puedan emitir decisiones cuando sea requerido. Gracias.
Gracias. Alejandro, from COFEPRIS, the same question. How did you all in Mexico approach these challenges that Maria Margarita was just speaking about? Over to you. Is Alejandro with us at this point?
Mac, I believe they had the problem. Sorry.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, I just communicated with them. We can circle back. So.
All right, thanks. I've just heard that Cofepris is having a problem technically joining us, so hopefully they will be able to before the end of the session. Why don't we move on then to Haiti at WHO Geneva? And Haiti, I think all of us know that prior to your coming to WHO, you were the head of the Tanzanian agency. So you obviously have walked in the shoes of many of the people who are talking today. You know the reality and the pressures that are on national agencies. So people at WHO Geneva obviously were looking at ways that they could assist national agencies in the work they had to do. And one of the things that became part of our regulatory lexicon now is the phrase EUL, which many people perhaps did not know about previously, for the emergency use listing. And this was an innovative approach promoting alignment of regulatory processes as it was implemented. But one of the things that I think many of us were impressed with as you all implemented the EUL this time, particularly for vaccines, where you brought regulators from various parts of the world to come together to be part of the EUL assessment program, which we know particularly really did expedite the registration of EUL vaccines and the authorization of vaccines, particularly in Africa, through some of the innovative collaborative procedures that you all set up. Do you want to talk a little bit about those and what you think were some of the key elements of the work that WHO Geneva and the regional offices did to help the national authorities, during this pandemic? Thanks. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Mark, and of course, a very good morning to all the participants. Good afternoon from Geneva. I'm also very honored to join you in this very important conference covering Maria-Angela Simao, my Assistant Director General, who was to join you, but she has some emergency and therefore could not make it. So thanks, Mark, also for that question, but also for the background. To the fact that I have been on the shoes of the regulators that are attending this conference now. So first of all, to thank actually those countries that actually contributed to the WHO-led global assessment that actually brought together regulatory experts from across the 6 WHO regions to join us in terms of assessing the applications that were submitted for emergency use listing as soon as these products, the vaccines became available from the manufacturers. So in terms of the most relevant successes that we can share in terms of this approach was in fact the inclusiveness and of course inviting regulators from the countries to join the global assessment team. And I must say that, and as you rightly put it out, that has been the question most of the time from the regulators, that WHO has been promoting reliance, but then the question is that regulators are not fully informed in terms of what is actually to be relied upon, where is the evidence, and therefore the fact that the regulators from across the member states were actually, from across our 6 regions were actually invited. This brought about inclusiveness, but also efficiency in the process, and particularly with respect to the fact that there was acceptability also of the outcomes as soon as the EULs were granted. So apart from the actual participation, and some of you recall that we had actually a number of preparatory webinars in 2020 before the actual assessments did take place. We actually had organized close to 20 such webinars across the globe, several of them in the region of the Americas. And we also, some of you also recall that we were actually issuing what we call biweekly regulatory updates and preparing regulators for the vaccines that will be coming to them for assessment and of course, immediate approvals. So we see that countries did feel involved, and therefore bringing the ownership to the process, but also making them ready to rely on the outcomes with confidence, because there was evidence for which they can rely upon, because they were actually themselves part of the process. Our pre-qualification team also provided access to dossiers. This was very critical because many manufacturers could not actually submit applications directly to all our 194 member states, and therefore, upon signing of the confidentiality disclosure agreement, manufacturers therefore did not need to approach each and of course in every country or every regulator and submit separate applications. So as we did not know, of course, as they did not know in advance which vaccine will actually be going to which country under the COVAX facility. So these are some of the lessons that we can take up. And as some of you may be aware, the results of this process were actually amazing. We witnessed regulatory agilities and flexibilities, of course, in practice. We have had, for example, 101 countries granting emergency use authorizations within the first 15 days following the first emergency use listings by WHO in mid-February this year. And in my view, this is actually a record number in the history of application of reliance principles, and therefore facilitating timely access to much needed vaccines during a pandemic. As we speak today, we have witnessed, I can give you one example because I'm also sitting at the interface between our regional offices and the countries in terms of promoting approvals of vaccines that are supplied through the COVAX facility, be it a donation, be it allocation, for example, for AstraZeneca vaccines alone. We have seen over 1,000 regulatory authorizations coming from multiple donors, but also from multiple manufacturing sites across our member states, close to 120 countries that have actually received these doses, but also having authorized based on WHO emergency use listing, and also under exceptional circumstances based on emergency use authorizations by stringent regulatory authorities. So a big thank you to all those who supported this process. We have also, all of us, witnessed the success in terms of countries actually getting the doses that they needed through the COVAX facility. And this is something that we can all be proud of. And back to you, Mark. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hidi. Very, very much appreciated. You know, I think one of the things that all of us realized was that when you are putting products into a larger population based on incomplete data, you really are having to depend on your post-marketing pharmacovigilance system and surveillance systems to really feed back information that allows you to do the iterative regulation that this kind of a pandemic requires. And so I'd like to turn to our colleagues from the Uppsala Monitoring Center with a question. Penelope, as the as you are the center for pharmacovigilance information sharing and analysis, when you all saw what was happening around the world, that these products were being released as they had to be under these circumstances, I'm sure you realized that people were going to be looking to you all and to national pharmacovigilance systems to provide the data that would be needed to see if indeed these products really maintained their positive benefit risk profile. Were there any things that you all did differently at Uppsala? Were there things, programs that you implemented to try to address what you knew were going to be coming in as far as reports? And as we all know, it's not only, you know, getting the reports, but it's risk analysis, it's risk management, it's risk communication. I mean, this is all part of a quality pharmacovigilance system. So how did you all approach this at the Uppsala Center?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you. And first of all, a very good morning to you all, and thank you, Paolo, for this kind invite to the panel discussion. It has been a pleasure listening to the keynote speaker, the introduction of the moderator, and the discussion of this honorable assembly. So thank you. Thank you for that question. I mean, there were a kind of preparation phase for us at the Uppsala Monitoring Center. And the first step was actually to make sure that the tools for reporting to the global, the WHO global database, that reporting was possible on a national level. Because, well, if we turn back time 1 year, there were not many COVID vaccine reports in the WHO database. Now there are 2.7 million vaccine reports. So in a preparedness phase, it was important to make sure that the tools for data collection were there. So there were some add-ons developed for the UMC tools for the data collection, VigiFlow, as you might heard of. There was an expansion for the WHO IAFI form and a vaccine e-reporting tool that allowed healthcare workers to report through an easy to access online form. Then what happened when we came back after Christmas, there was a rapid growth of reports. And this led to a period of intense work focus across most areas of the UMC. For example, terminology specialists dedicated considerable resources into covering all the variants of vaccines in the WHO dictionary for incoming reports, so that analysis could take place in the next step. So that was a very important thing. The UMC Signal team worked continually to analyze the data that came in. They provided signal reports as well as publishing a monthly descriptive reports of the global reporting pattern. And that report has been well received also in this region, and it seems to be of value to many national centers. The volumes and rate of incoming reports caused a rethinking of UMC's internal signal prioritization strategy. The Signal team have collaborated successfully with WHO headquarters and also with the new group of external clinical experts helping us with the clinical assessments. And our collaborating center is there to complement what regulators are doing, not to replicate. So this has also made us collaborate in a totally new way, I would say. So, and next, in parallel, we have also offered PV education and training during the pandemic in different settings, and now we have even more learners. We reach even more learners with our new learning management system. We have offered virtual training in Spanish, for example, on our analysis tool Vigilize. And this week, UMC gives an online PV core series in Spanish with participants from 11 countries from the POWER region. So we have adapted to this very special period, I would say, and I will leave the floor to our CEO, Hervé Lelouet, to say something about the future approach. Over to you, Hervé.
Thank you very much, Penelope. Good day to all. Thank you very much for inviting us to this prestigious meeting. I'm Hervé Lelouet, so I'm Professor of Clinical Pharmacology, and I'm the new CEO of the Uppsala Monitoring Center. Of course, Penelope talked about the preparation we did. It was a difficult period because finally we came in the pandemic, and during this pandemic, the CEO changed. So we'll have to face some bumping period because we needed to adapt and to really to adapt all the tools because it was acting like more or less a crash test. So we implemented immediately some key measures that Penelope commented, but we also planned for the future because, as I told you, the pandemics act like a crash test and show the limits of the way we are detecting signal and assessing signal currently. So we had recently with ET a high-level meeting with many scientific people to see how we can improve the quality of the signals detected via disproportionality in VG-base, which is like, say, Penelope, a 30 million ICSR inside. So we will progress on that. As Penelope mentioned already, we are developing a kind of privileged partnership with the best experts in every field of medicine all over the world. So we'll try to provide the PIDM with all the best possible signal we have. But as said, our colleague McLumpkin is that now PIDM, it's not only drug monitoring, it's also to continue and to act in the field of risk management. So we need to develop tools aiming not only to detect the signal, true signal and validated signal, but also to allow all the people to assess the impact of the signal in their own setting and to give them some element to use the resource they have in the best way to mitigate this risk. It's what I wanted to say, and Penelope, if you want to continue, I'm happy to give you the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Javier. I think I have said what I wanted for this question, so thank you.
Thank you both, Penelope and Hervé, for your contributions there. I just have a follow-up question for the two of you. One of the things that we often hear is that much of the data that has supported the EUAs either comes from Europe, or it comes from North America, or it comes from China. But there are many parts of the world that did not participate in the clinical trials. And there's always the question about, are there differences in how these vaccines either are effective or have safety issues based on other issues that might not have been addressed looking at the clinical trials population. Are you all at the point yet, looking at these 2 million reports that have come in, that you can begin to look, are there regional specific signals that you are beginning to detect, or, which would be the news I think everyone would want to hear, you're not detecting them, and people can extrapolate the data from the clinical trials more globally than perhaps they thought they could. Can either of you address that issue at this point?
Thank you very much for this question, because for us it's a key issue. First of all, VG-base is mostly a database of post-marketing ICSR, so we have a few clinical trials inside. Second, it's true that we have many cases coming from the US, coming from Europe, coming from the main country, I would say, of ICH, and less from India, Africa, and even China. It depends sometimes on the quality of the different setting. But in a way, we are aware of that, and we try to find some solution on how to assess signal adapted to the country where they are according to what we have. So that's true that the question raised is that what is the validity of a signal detected at the global level when it comes to specific setting? And it is the way I want to develop the UMC, because we try to explore how to sometimes handle the database in a different way. But we had some example during the pandemic showing that we had true signal, validated signal, but finally, when you talk with different countries, they said, but we are not concerned with that. And finally, they are reluctant to use information we provide them. So we must be clever on that and to always adapt the signal in different settings. It's not easy. For that, we must have a more pharmacoepidemiological approach. This is why we are working with different other organizations, aiming to put a denominator to this numerator, and then to have a measure of the impact of the signal detected at the worldwide level, but what is the impact at the regional level. So the problem is not so much to have a lot of data, because we have data coming from all over the world. Of course, we have much more from the US and Europe, but it doesn't mean that we can't do something in Africa, in China, in India, or other different settings. But we need to modify a bit the approach, and once again, to have much more risk management oriented strategy rather than only detecting signal in a global database where we know that we reach some limit.
Super. Thank you very, very much. One of the other issues that I think we all know occurs once these products are in wider circulation is that we know, unfortunately, that we live in a world where there are people who have a much more nefarious agenda and not a public health agenda. And we start beginning to see substandard and falsified versions of these products coming on the market. So I would like to turn right now to Ron at USP, because this is an issue I know, Ron, that USP has particularly been focused on, and quality and assuring the quality in the marketplace of products. And are there things that you all have done? Are there ideas that you can share with our audience here on this issue of substandard and falsified COVID-19 products? Thanks. Over to you.
Thank you, Mac. And I really do appreciate the chance to speak here and to join these fellow panelists. And before I share some of course, what we all know are real challenges and even things that can be quite disappointing, I do want to just really applaud the overall amazing effort by both the industry and regulators to bring these life-saving vaccines in absolutely remarkable time to billions around the world. That said, all of that good news, the falsified substandard medicines, of course, are always a challenge. One thing that is just logically clear, but also backed up very strongly by the data, is that when you have a combination of high demand and constricted supply, it creates the highest likelihood for both substandard and then especially counterfeit medicines, in this case, vaccines. One of the challenges, the additional challenges, of course, of the pandemic is that it created also very rapid and repeated demand spikes for different kinds of medical products, including medicines, both medicines that were directly related to treating COVID and those that were perhaps ancillary to treat other diseases and then were being used in the pandemic. And then if you combine the supply chain challenges that you saw around the world just in general, including reduced airlines, reduced flights where a lot of the medicines were being transmitted. And what you ended up with was, reduction in the supply chain, a spike in demand, and a high demand leading to substandard and counterfeits. That's a lot of stress on that system. The final piece here, Mac, as you think about the substandard falsified is a matter of course, detecting and trying to remove, but you also want to create disincentives, or in the other case, incentives. And at USP, of course, was an institution founded 200 years ago with a very simple purpose, which is to improve the supply of quality medicines, at first in the US and now globally. We adhere to that simple piece, which is a substandard medicine is not quality. A counterfeit medicine is certainly not. And so it's a bit of a back to basics. In the basics of ensuring a medicine quality, which is not just the production, but also how it is being shipped and transmitted, and then by the user to have the tools available to be able to play at least some role in ensuring that what they're delivering is of good quality, which can be challenging in a complex medicine like a vaccine.
Thanks so much, Ron. Very much appreciated. All of the work that the regulators and our colleagues in the post-marketing world do really has no impact if the products don't actually make it to the patients who need them. And that's obviously a supply chain issue that have many people involved. And so I'd like to turn to Daniel now, if I could. And Daniel, as in your position, as you tried to implement your strategy to help the PAHO member states access quality products in this very dynamic, iterative ecosystem of the pandemic, what were some of the main hurdles that you encountered? How did you approach these? And I guess really more importantly, what do you think are things we could do better next time, both from the regulatory agency perspective and from the industry perspective? Thanks. Over to you.
Thank you, Mac. And voy a hablar en español. Muchas gracias, Mac. Muchas gracias y gracias por la invitación a este panel. En sí, me gustaría referirme a la estrategia que tomamos en las Américas para poder responder a la pandemia en cuanto a temas de compras, también a los retos y también los aciertos y recomendaciones. En cuanto a la estrategia, las Américas tienen una gran ventaja comparado a otras regiones del mundo para el acceso a tecnologías de salud como medicamentos y vacunas. Por décadas tenemos los dos mecanismos, el fondo rotatorio para acceso a vacunas y el fondo estratégico en el cual facilitamos la adquisición de medicamentos, vacunas y otras importantes tecnologías a los países miembros. Estas dos mecanismos regionales pasaron a ser parte de los mecanismos globales o iniciativas globales bajo el ACT o el Accelerator. Un ejemplo clave es con el tema de COVAX, o sea, junto con UNICEF, PAHO, OPS, implementó la estrategia de compras y manejó la licitación ¿no? de este mecanismo. En el tema de retos, o sea, bien, tenemos el setting bien, tenemos el mecanismo regional, el mecanismo global. Sin embargo, enfrentamos algunos retos. Por ejemplo, solo 4% de los insumos relacionados con la respuesta de COVID fueron de nuestra región. Entonces, tuvimos una gran dependencia de mercados como Asia, Europa y los Estados Unidos. Sin embargo, estos mercados que eran muy conocidos por la OPS con productos de calidad, nos enfrentaron con prácticas de políticas de proteccionismo, cantidades limitadas, dificultades de logísticas para traer estos productos a nuestros países. Y esto obligó a buscar alternativas de productos nuevos con productores que no conocían de los aspectos técnicos y regulatorios y documentación que la OPS requeriría. Creo que esto fue uno de los mayores retos, pero yo creo que hay que reconocer los aciertos y ver cómo estos aciertos se pueden expandir a otras tecnologías en las cuales tuvimos los retos. Y estos aciertos creo que en el tema de vacunas, fue el reconocer el estándar de OMS, lista de uso de emergencia, el WHO, la aplicación del reliance regulatorio y la colaboración de actores claves en temas regulatorios. Entonces, bajo el WHO dentro de COVAX, se facilitó mucho la información entre los productores, entre el mecanismo COVAX, en los países mediante estos firmas de acuerdos de confidencialidad por parte de las agencias con la OMS. Y esto logró un impacto muy importante, no solo en las prácticas de autorización, sino también en las prácticas de compras. O sea, para la licitación no requerimos que OPS hiciera una evaluación de los productos o que UNICEF hiciera otra evaluación, sino que facilitó muchísimo la negociación y el establecer los contratos con las empresas farmacéuticas. Y también evitó atender requisitos país por país. Entonces fue una gran facilidad, un gran acierto el approach que se tomó con el mecanismo COVAX. Y aquí la industria tuvo un rol muy importante para permitir ese intercambio, ¿no? Para poder facilitar ese intercambio. Y también la OMS. La OMS fue crítica en garantizar la transparencia en todos los procesos que se llevaron a cabo. En cuanto a reliance, sin las prácticas de reliance o el reconocimiento de los procesos de precalificación de la OMS, hubiera sido muy difícil poder hacer estas compras. Así que yo creo que esto es un acierto que, no, como recomendación, tendría un impacto si este approach se expandiera a otras tecnologías sanitarias, ¿no? Mediante la alianza que se logró con las agencias regulatorias, la colaboración con la industria y también atraer a la industria a hacer disponibles sus productos a través de estos mecanismos de compras conjuntas como los fondos rotatorios de la OPS. Yo creo que igual, escuchando a Elizabeth del FDA, fue muy importante la flexibilidad y también lo que es el engagement, la colaboración de todas las partes. Yo creo que eso fue clave en este acierto que lo estamos viendo con el caso de OPS y su experiencia como parte del mecanismo COVAX.
Gracias, Daniel. Thank you for your contribution there. I understand our colleague Alejandro Sparch from COFEPRIS has been able to join us. Alejandro, are you on and can you hear us? Great, wonderful. It looks like you are perhaps muted. Now you're unmuted. Great, thanks. I want to ask you the same question that we asked Maria Margarita from INVIMA earlier in the session, and that is, as a national agency, you obviously during this pandemic, and particularly in the early parts of the pandemic, were under a great deal of pressure from your political leaders, from your consumers, from your media, for making decisions when you really had incomplete data and you still wanted to make a scientifically robust decision, but a flexible decision that weighed the benefits and the risks as you knew them at that time and under the circumstances. Can you tell us a little bit about how COFEPRIS approached dealing with these pressures from the political leadership, from the media, from consumers, from industry, to stay the course and to do the job that you have to do to promote and to protect public health in Mexico? Over to you. Thanks.
Muchas gracias. A nombre de la Comisión Federal para la Protección contra Riesgos Sanitarios, agradecemos este espacio y celebramos la activación de todos los trabajos de la Conferencia Panamericana de Armonización de Reglamentación Farmacéutica. Yo creo que la pregunta que nos señalan es muy interesante. Sin lugar a duda, todas las agencias sanitarias de nuestra región, e independientemente del nivel de madurez que tengamos, la pandemia por COVID-19 generó un espacio de mucha presión para las agencias sanitarias. Y las agencias sanitarias y sus mecanismos de calidad fueron los responsables de garantizar que las decisiones que se tomaran, incluso en condiciones de mucha presión, sean las decisiones que fundamenten el principio rector de la protección sanitaria. Y esta es garantizar que los insumos para la salud que se puedan dar sean siempre con calidad, con seguridad y con la eficacia que todos merecemos. Particularmente el acceso equitativo a los dispositivos médicos es un elemento prioritario de los sistemas de salud. El fortalecimiento de la capacidad reguladora en la región, en nuestro continente, se ha incrementado de manera gradual con la aplicación de estrategias para el logro de los objetivos de protección contra los riesgos sanitarios en el continente. Hemos intercambiado experiencias, una mayor colaboración entre nuestros países, destacando, por supuesto, la importante labor que ha desarrollado el Grupo de Trabajo de Regulación de Medicamentos y Dispositivos Médicos de la Organización Panamericana de la Salud, incentivando la cooperación y el entendimiento de esta problemática que hemos tenido todas las agencias. Como parte de una visión de protección a la salud y de salud como un derecho, sin duda, uno de nuestros ejes de acción en COFEPRIS es garantizar la eficacia, seguridad y calidad de los equipos, de los dispositivos, de los medicamentos, y que esta decisión esté libre de cualquier tipo de interferencia política y libre de cualquier tipo de presión dada por la pandemia. Para tal propósito, consideramos que el ejercicio del control y la regulación sanitaria comprende diversas disposiciones ya establecidas que nos permiten trabajar en esta hoja de ruta en la convergencia normativa específicamente enfocada en dispositivos médicos y medicamentos, que nos permita a las agencias regulatorias tomar decisiones de forma más rápida, usando la opinión técnica y científica de otras agencias regulatorias de nuestra región. No sé si con eso más o menos expliqué la propuesta de intervención que proponemos desde COFEPRIS para este problema.
Gracias, Alejandro. Very much appreciate your contribution there, and that's a very clear, helpful explanation. Maria Margarita, could I come back to you, perhaps, for another question? When you answered originally, you talked about instituting an emergency use authorization system in Colombia. Obviously, at the time, you had fairly robust data on the efficacy of the vaccines, but clearly no long-term safety data on the vaccines. So you, I'm sure, looked at how you could work with your national immunization program to get more data once the vaccines started rolling out to the people there in Colombia. Can you tell us a little bit about how you worked with your national immunization program to get data and to make joint decisions going forward once the EUA was issued and vaccines started going out to the Colombian people? Thank you.
Bueno, muchas gracias. Definitivamente pienso que uno de los problemas que se evidenciaron con esta pandemia fue la dificultad en el acceso a la información. Creo que todos los países lo hemos vivido, lo hemos visto de cerca y hemos visto los efectos de no tener acceso a la información, de manera que hemos tratado de mantener una cooperación constante con toda la región y con todos los países, los organismos. Eso es algo muy bueno que ha pasado con esta pandemia, y es que hemos podido coordinar mucho mejor canales de información. Eso como punto de partida, pero ya en el país hemos tenido estrategias, hemos trabajado con el Ministerio de Salud, con el Instituto Nacional de Salud y el INVIMA en un proceso de farmacovigilancia que incluya toda la cadena de distribución, y que realmente los reportes que necesitamos recibir como agencia regulatoria sean recibidos y tengan el proceso de seguimiento adecuado para que la información se vea fortalecida y que haya un seguimiento continuo, que no haya interrupción en eso. Entonces sí hemos tenido ese sistema con varios actores, con la herramienta VigiFlow, que también la estamos usando, y con otra serie de elementos de seguimiento continuo desde el INVIMA y con las otras entidades para detectar y poder alertar en los casos en que se considere necesario también. Muchas gracias.
Gracias. Hiti, could I turn to you for a second question, please? I know you mentioned in your first response the WHO's perspective on reliance and on promoting reliance as a best 21st century regulatory practice. We all know you have come out recently with a good reliance practices document that really, I think, for many of us around the world kind of sealed this practice as a best regulatory practice. I think early on you talked about how people were relying on the EUL and how effective that was. But I think we also know that you at WHO also rely on work that is done by agencies in various parts of the world. And as we look at the COVID vaccines in particular, I think your work with the European Medicines Agency stands out as an interesting way of collaborating and working together and relying on the work that the EMA was doing on these vaccines that helped really inform a lot of the EUL information and the EUL decision making. Can you talk a little bit about that part of this process and how you see going forward, not only agencies relying on WHO, but WHO relying on agencies to help with the pre-qualification and with the emergency use listing processes. Thanks. Over to you.
Yeah. Thank you again, Mark, for this follow-up question based on my previous response. So you are right that we collaborate with a number of mature agencies, and this is also, of course, in line with the principles that are in the recently published WHO guidelines on reliance that were published at the beginning of this year after a number of consultations with our member states. So as you may be aware, also some of the participants here may be aware that our pre-qualification program has actually indeed a procedure in place, what we call abbreviated or streamlined assessment pathway, when we rely on what we call national regulatory authorities of reference. And this was already published in one of our technical report series that is adopted by the Expert Committee on Biological Standardization. So we have a list of agencies there that PQ do rely on them, and we have 11 of those agencies. They are actually on our website. And the European Medicines Agency is one of those agencies that we rely in the case of vaccines assessment. And PQ has, of course, agreements with a number of such agencies in order to allow for accelerated assessments, but also approvals based on the same principles of reliance, that it's not only that countries rely on the output that comes from the PQ, but also PQ vaccines also do rely on other, it's also applicable for medicines. So this has been the spirit in terms of our collaboration with the European Medicines Agency, and especially for vaccines that are donated through the COVAX facility, and especially or where there are bilateral agreements with the countries between the donor and the recipient. So we do also promote this reliance approaches. We have, of course, as I said, we have an agreement with the European Medicines Agency for exchanging information, including the assessment reports, letters of a list of questions, and also the responses that they receive when they are undertaking the assessments. What is new in this particular case during this COVID response with the European Medicines Agency is what they call the COVID Task Force program, which also allows us as WHO to actually participate in the discussions on specific vaccines candidates for emergency use listing. And during the parallel review of these vaccines, our team also received the questions from the European Medicines Agency to the applicants, and the responses that they also get. So this has been of course the practice. I just wanted to also to add in terms of the work that we have also been undertaking over the last 2 or 3 years with regards to the new concept of replacing the WHO, replacing the concept of stringent regulatory authorities with the WHO listed authorities, which has attracted discussions from across our member states over the past few years with the policy adopted in 2020 and of course published this year with the definition to replace the stringent regulatory authorities. We also foresee that this framework of WHO listed authorities will also have a major impact in terms of how we will be seeing reliance in the future, because this will be through a pathway where we have evidence in terms of the performance of those agencies that WHO will rely, but also other regulators will be relying on them. And we see this as a new concept of smart regulation, which is based on the principles of reliance, and as clearly also articulated in the policy document. The intentions and the benefits of the WLA will be to actually promote trust and confidence, and also building reliance among regulators. But most important is also to increase the pool of those authorities, in addition to the 11 that I've mentioned, for example, in the area of vaccines, but of course we have a bigger number for medicines as well. The pool of those agencies that we can rely upon in terms of our streamlined assessment procedures, and therefore increasing efficiency in our assessments, and including inspections, and therefore ensuring that there's immediate access of much needed products, especially during the pandemics, as we have witnessed during, of course, during the current COVID-19 pandemic. So the ultimate goal of all these efforts is to make sure that everybody receives across the globe, regardless of where they are, safe, effective, and quality assured medical products, in this case, vaccines. And we see that we are making good progress. We have received several comments from regulators over the last few months, and now we are working on the comments on the operational guidance. And we are looking forward together with the regulators, especially from the region of the Americas, where we received substantive comments to get the operational guidance of the WHO listed authority in place, and we have this into action from 2022. So thank you, and back to you, Mark.
Thanks very much, Hidi. I know the work you all have done on the WLA process has been a real labor of love, and it has been a tremendous lift for many, many people, not only in Geneva, but as you say, in the regional offices and in various stakeholder groups around the world. I know we're all looking forward to the ultimate implementation of it and seeing how it really does affect this whole process of regulation through reliance pathways going forward in the years to come. I have one more question I want to ask Alejandro, but before I do that, if there are questions from those of you listening, please go to the Q&A button on the screen and place your questions there. We've gotten one question, and I will ask that one to the panel after this question to Alejandro. But if there are other questions, please put them there, and we will try to get to as many as we possibly can in the time we have allotted for this panel discussion. Alejandro, when you were talking a few minutes ago, you talked about reliance and how you all were approaching this during the pandemic. One of the things I wanted to ask was, as you look at your approaches to reliance and trying to figure out how you might use that in years to come, what you might do better, can you comment on, were you able to use the WHO EUL listings? Were there PAHO information that was helpful to you? What did you find helpful? What did you find not helpful? And what would you do better in the next pandemic in this aspect of reliance? Thanks.
Muchas gracias, Mac, por la pregunta. Yo creo que el informe regional lanzado por la Organización Panamericana de la Salud este año, fortalecimiento de los sistemas regulatorios en la región de las Américas, enseñadas obtenidas de las agencias regulatorias de alta referencia, destaca un aspecto importantísimo y responde esta pregunta, y es que la optimización regulatoria de los sistemas regulatorios representan sin lugar a duda un elemento esencial para el buen funcionamiento de la salud. La pandemia claramente ha mostrado esto, y bajo esta premisa, la convergencia regulatoria en la región de las Américas tiene un rol fundamental para el entendimiento de nuestros procesos asociados a la regulación de productos farmacéuticos, lo que contribuye, digámoslo así, sin dejar de lado para nada el rigor técnico y científico, en avanzar con mayor determinación hacia la construcción de confianza en las decisiones de nuestras autoridades, con la finalidad de evitar la duplicidad de recursos y sin perder de vista la continuidad de los esfuerzos ya existentes de cooperación técnica para fortalecer las capacidades regulatorias de toda la región. El planteamiento de recomendaciones estratégicas que nos propone este documento para fortalecer las autoridades regulatorias en su labor y en su contexto de la pandemia por COVID-19 nos ha dejado de manifiesto importantes áreas de oportunidad para revalorar y hacia dónde nos debemos de dirigir como agencias regulatorias y sobre todo cuáles son las herramientas y medidas que requerimos para mejorar las capacidades en el ámbito sanitario. Nosotros hemos identificado algunas que nos gustaría compartir con ustedes. En primer orden, la adaptabilidad. Avanzar en la adaptabilidad de nuestra normativa ante emergencias sanitarias. Creo que el COVID dejó de manifiesto la necesidad de poder avanzar en estos cambios. La simplificación de nuestros procesos regulatorios para las autorizaciones de insumo para la salud de impacto en el manejo de una pandemia. La digitalización de nuestros trámites es algo muy importante que las agencias regulatorias de la región debemos de poner en la mesa. Esto evita el conflicto de intereses, esto evita la discrecionalidad, le da más trazabilidad a los dossiers que analizamos. Por supuesto, y se han señalado ampliamente en esta mesa, el intercambio de información técnica y científica, sobre todo esa información de impacto en la toma de decisiones de carácter regulatorio. Por otro lado, también identificamos que resulta ineludible para disminuir las inequidades en materia de salud pública y de acceso a medicamentos, reconocer que un adecuado esquema de colaboración y transferencia de tecnología entre las regiones norte-sur y sur-sur, tanto en los sectores públicos como son el sector privado, puede fructificar en más y mejores prácticas de innovación con miras en el desarrollo de nuevos productos dirigidos al tratamiento de las principales enfermedades de nuestros países. Creemos que esto es muy importante y de esta manera intentamos dar respuestas a tu pregunta, Mac. Muchas gracias.
Gracias, Alejandro. It does. Thank you very much. One of the questions from the audience, I think perhaps, I mean, obviously, any of you, if you would like to answer, please join in. But I think perhaps Hiti and Maria Margarita, since you also mentioned this, maybe we could go to you two first. The question was, we've talked a lot about the primary authorization of these products and reliance and EUAs and getting these primarily authorized. Obviously, there needs to be continued flow of information because we're learning. This is a very iterative process, as we've talked about. What do you see as ways to improve sharing learnings as the process goes on after the primary authorization? Are there things, Hiti, you all are doing at WHO RPQ to enhance and to make easier the sharing of new data? And perhaps Maria Margarita, you on the receiving end, are there things that you would like to see? Are there ways you think information could be shared more efficiently, more quickly, and more helpfully to the national authorities? Hiti, first to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mark, for this follow-up question. And of course, my colleague Elizabeth has also provided some answer to one of the questions in the Q&A. Just to say that for countries that have, which is majority of the low and middle income countries that have signed the confidentiality disclosure agreement with our pre-qualification team, they have access, as I said in my previous interventions, they have access to full documentation that is submitted to WHO secure platform. and therefore they have access to the original documentation, full dossier from the manufacturer, but also they have access to assessment reports. So that's one. And secondly, if there are any changes post-emergency use listing, that is also submitted to our vaccines assessment team. This information will also be available to those who have access, and this is majority of these countries, and therefore any post-approval or post-emergency use listing changes that the manufacturers share, and that is also reviewed by our PQ team, is also made available to those who have signed this agreement. So basically we are doing whatever we can, and we have actually seen this in practice during this period when we are actually very much coordinating, for example, approval of donations that were coming from sites that receive additional manufacturing sites, for example, that were not initially on the initial EUL and which were submitted later and therefore added to the list. So I give an example again, go back to AstraZeneca, where we have, I think, close to between 8 and 9 additional, different manufacturing sites for drug substance and of course drug product, and therefore all these changes that happened after the original, the very first EUL, these changes are also accessible to the countries, and countries can check and can verify before they actually approve and authorize vaccines to go into the country. So this has been what we have been doing, and we have seen this being beneficial to our member states, and we have some actually very latest experiences, not in the region of the Americas, but in other regions where one of the countries was actually receiving a donation, and their national law is requiring that they have to be a local company which has to submit an application. So this DAME application has to be made, and then the information, and this was actually a variation. And for them to approve, the only source of information was also on our secure platform, and we facilitated that, and the country was able to receive a donation, and based on the evidence that they were able to get, which was not available in the original, the very first emergency use authorization by the country. So this is in practice, and we see that this should be also the future when we also have therapeutics in place. Thank you.
Thank you, Hiti. Elizabeth Plut from the PQ unit, I see you have your hand raised. Do you want to make an intervention here before we go to Maria Margarita?
Yes, if you don't mind.
Please.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Hola todo el mundo. Buenos días, buenas tardes. So I just would like to add to what Hiti said. So we have the secured platform. We use SharePoint for this. And so it allows us to, where the manufacturer uploads the dossier on their side. We use it for the review, and as Hiti explained, we have the NRAs from different regions, different countries participating in this review process. And then at the end of the process, once we've given EUL recommendation, we share it with the countries. So as we all should not forget, so these vaccines have not finalized their development. So they're still in clinical phase 3 trials are ongoing. So every time when we list a vaccine on our website, there's also, when we publish the report, we also come with the list of post EUL recommendations and requirements. So there's a whole list that the manufacturers need to abide to be able, and also of course one of the requirements when we accept an expression of interest is that the vaccine is close to receiving an emergency approval, an emergency authorization at country level, but also at the end, the manufacturer, once we give an EUL recommendation or listing, the manufacturer has to finalize the product and towards pre-qualification. So in this period, there's these post-deal commitments that we request from the manufacturer. So these are also then every time uploaded on our website, in the Secure platform, and where it's public information, this will be then translated into being available in our website. For example, the product insights, inserts, the product leaflets, or the SNPC as they call them in Europe. Each time there's an update, we review the clinical dossier. My colleagues review the clinical dossier. we have this dossier is information available for the NRAs, but then the public information is then the product inserts that then are posted on our website. So we've got this constant flow of updating and making sure that the countries have access to the latest information. If they still have technical questions, as Hiti said also earlier, we have these webinars, these meetings that we had all over the global level with the different regions, where we specifically answer questions from NRAs to make sure that they're comfortable with the decision-making process. And also we respond to individual questions. We've got an email address and I can put it in the chat. So any question people have, they can send an email to that. They can also send them an email in French or in Spanish, and Portuguese. I will use Google Translate to answer. But some of my colleagues speak, and if I don't have the answer, I make sure that the focal points, they can answer the questions. Because the whole idea of this process is that we assist the NRAs, that we facilitate their decision-making process. We've done it for Ebola, we've done it for NOPV2, we've done it for COVID. COVID was such a large scale that it's been more through bigger meetings, but we've participated in meetings with NRAs, also for NOPV, to make sure that the country feels comfortable, because these are important decisions that they take. They have a lot of responsibility on their shoulder, and we want to make sure that they're able to answer the questions to the Ministry of Health. Over.
Thank you very, very much. Maria Margarita, the last word from the national authorities' perspective, please.
Bueno, lo que han dicho Hiti y Elizabeth es fundamental. El rol, la labor de organismos como la OMS, OPS son muy necesarios en este tipo de situaciones, porque precisamente son una fuente de información confiable, transparente, no solo para nosotros como agencias regulatorias, sino para los gobiernos, los países, el ciudadano. O sea, creo que es muy importante esto que se ha hecho. Sí pienso que debemos seguir fortaleciendo las estrategias de comunicación y de cooperación para tener esa información, porque el hecho es distinto cuando es un gremio farmacéutico o una empresa, la industria farmacéutica, la que publica su información, a cuando es un organismo internacional o una agencia regulatoria. Esa información tiene más credibilidad frente al ciudadano, frente al gobierno, frente a las otras agencias regulatorias. Entonces, trabajar mucho en esas estrategias de comunicación para que siga esa transparencia, el diálogo directo, como decía Elizabeth, le podemos mandar un correo electrónico. Sí se ha visto en los resultados de tener ese diálogo directo, esta posibilidad, por ejemplo, hoy de poder hablar, que parece casi un desahogo de lo que ha pasado en cada país, en cada organismo, que a veces nos hemos sentido solos. O sea, como, ¿ahora qué hago? ¿Qué hago? Con ataques, con información por todos lados, los medios. Entonces, estamos en la misma situación. Y todo esto, o sea, fortalecer este sistema nos respalda las decisiones, nos da tranquilidad, y le da tranquilidad al final a un ciudadano que va a acceder a una vacuna, se va a vacunar y puede mirar la información sin sentir que le ocultan, que le dicen solo lo que puede saber porque hay algo raro. Ustedes saben todas las teorías de los movimientos antivacunas. Entonces sí hay una labor muy grande que se ha hecho, se nota el cambio, el avance, y creo que debemos todos esforzarnos por seguir en eso, junto con pues todas las herramientas de farmacovigilancia y regulación normativa, armonización normativa que se ha podido hacer bajo mucha presión en esta emergencia, pero ha dado muy buenos resultados porque los sistemas han evolucionado. Ya, con eso termino. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Maria Margarita. That was a beautiful way to end the panel discussion. We have run out of time for the panel discussion. I want to just again thank most heartily all of our panel members. Those of you who submitted questions, I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them, but again, thanks to all of the panel members. And I turn this over back to you, Dr. Gamarra, to finish the session. Thank you. I think you're muted, Dr. Gamara.
Muy bien. Sí, perdón. Sí, Mac, muchas gracias. Muchas gracias a los panelistas también por esta excelente discusión. De hecho, es un tema muy relevante. Podríamos quedar horas discutiendo sobre el tema. Contribuye mucho a tener bases sólidas para la convergencia regulatoria, así que muchísimas gracias por esta discusión. Queremos escuchar ahora al doctor Michael Rossum-Miles, director ejecutivo del Ministerio de Salud de Canadá, quien nos va a brindar un resumen de la sesión. Doctor Rossum-Miles, por favor, si abre su micrófono y adelante, por favor.
Thank you. I want to start off by thanking PAHO and the organizers for putting this excellent session together. I also wanted to express both my gratitude and congratulations to the regulatory bodies and international partners such as PAHO and WHO for their exceptional work throughout this pandemic. I think you should all be extremely proud of the contributions you've made to protecting the health of both your citizens, but also supporting human health on a global scale. So bravo, and I'll give you some applause for that. Thank you very much. If there's one thing that's been made very clearly evident during this pandemic, it's that we're all in this together. And that is only by viewing the challenges of COVID-19 from a global perspective that we can win the battle against this virus. Dr. Lumpkin actually said it very well when he expressed the novel pressures that we faced by our regulatory systems during this pandemic, complicating the way in which we assess risk and both make our regulatory decisions and communicate within and outside of our organizations. It was very interesting for me to hear from the panel members on how they adapted and evolved along with their environment to make and communicate regulatory decisions that were the most appropriate and beneficial based on the scientific data that was available at that time. And certainly we heard over and over again were the themes initially outlined by Dr. Hillebrenner of FDA, which were the value of regulatory flexibility and the power of engagement. Now, engagement with manufacturers was outlined as one important factor, but I would say engagement between regulatory partners and the WHO and PAHO needs to be emphasized as key to the success of our global outcomes. Information sharing, work sharing, and reliance are key components, not only to ensuring global equity, but also for harmonization of regulatory approaches and ensuring that vaccines and other treatments that are distributed throughout the world have met a similar stringent regulatory standard. Of course, a flexibility in these harmonized regulatory approaches was a key factor in the rapid manner in which we were able to respond to the pandemic. So we should note that the importance of pharmacovigilance and methods outlined by our Uppsala Monitoring Center colleagues, especially under conditions of regulatory flexibilities, are used under these conditions when pre-market authorization decisions are made using flexibilities. What this means is that increases in pre-market flexibilities need to be concomitant with increases in resources towards post-market monitoring activities, of which open communication, cooperation, and information sharing on a global scale is key. In closing, I'd like to restate the importance of global collaboration that was emphasized by my colleague Alejandro Schwarz of the Mexican Federal Commission, and of taking our lessons learned during the pandemic to strengthen our collaboration, cooperation, and reliance to support equities in all areas of global health and not just in the pandemic. So thank you very much for inviting me to close the meeting today. I had a wonderful time listening to the presentations and the discussions, and I look forward to further interactions with PAHO in the future.
Muchas gracias, Michael, por este excelente resumen de nuestra sesión. Quiero volver a agradecer a los panelistas por su contribución, al moderador por también sus valiosas, por su valiosa opinión y sus valiosas contribuciones. Muchas gracias, Mac. Bueno, con esto podemos dar cerrada la sesión. Quiero pasarle la palabra al secretario de la red PARF por si quiera hacer algún comentario final. Para mí ha sido un honor presidir esta sesión pero muy interesante. Ojalá se repita pronto. Agradecer a la red PARF por esta posibilidad que nos da de juntar a las agencias regulatorias y trabajar en la convergencia y la armonización regulatoria. Y bueno, doy la palabra entonces al secretario de la red PARF para cualquier otra contribución que quiera hacer.
Gracias, doctora Gamarra. Saludos. Muy interesante la discusión y el panel. En nombre del secretariado de la red que ejerce la Organización Panamericana de la Salud y junto con nuestros colegas de OMS, queremos resaltar, como lo decían recién los colegas, el doctor Rosmals, el rol que los reguladores, que los técnicos, el personal del Ministerio de Salud, de las instituciones diversas que hoy tratamos incluso de tener aquí representadas, han tenido en esta pandemia. Una tarea muy intensa y por eso les invitamos, mientras damos las palabras finales, a abrir sus cámaras para poder tener la foto, esta foto de la segunda sesión. Les pedimos por favor que abran sus cámaras y también nos sumamos al aplauso a su tarea. En particular, mientras abren, por favor, no queremos tenerlos a todos en la foto final, así que del día de hoy. Mientras abren sus cámaras, queremos hacer una mención especial para un reconocimiento que hoy el director general de OMS ha otorgado a Carmen Amelia Rodríguez Hernández, que es originaria de esta región y que ha sido participante de la red PARF, por su dedicación, constancia, innovación y liderazgo en el proceso de precalificación de vacunas y de uso de emergencia. Muchos la conocen a Carmen Amelia porque han estado en interacción con ella a través de los procesos que Hiti ya ha descrito también, y facilitó enormemente la participación activa de las autoridades reguladoras y el intercambio de información de acuerdo a las condiciones de confidencialidad que las agencias acordaron con OMS. Por nuestros colegas de OMS, le acercamos a Carmen nuestro saludo, nuestras felicitaciones muy merecidas, y también acercamos a nuestros compañeros de OMS, al equipo de la doctora Simao, que siempre nos ha estado apoyando a lo largo de estos 2 años difíciles, a Hiti, pero también muchos colegas, el equipo de la doctora Yantipal en seguridad, de manejo de vigilancia, de vacunas. Así que muchísimas gracias a ellos también, agradecemos su presencia hoy aquí. Y mientras, no sé si ya tenemos la foto, queremos invitarlos para este viernes, el viernes 10 a las 9 de la mañana, a la tercera sesión en la que tendremos el desafío de plantear comentarios para la agenda post-COVID-19. ¿Qué vamos a encarar en el futuro en virtud de las lecciones aprendidas durante esta pandemia? Y además tendremos también una sesión informativa sobre la nueva propuesta de resolución que se enviará a cuerpos directivos a la reunión de la próxima conferencia panamericana, conferencia sanitaria panamericana, aquí en OPS, con la presencia de los ministros de salud de los países, para aprobación de una nueva política para fortalecer los sistemas regulatorios. De manera que estaremos informando ahí de la propuesta, del proceso, y entonces los invitamos el próximo viernes a las 9 de la mañana. No sé si ya tenemos la foto, y si queremos hacer un último ejercicio, Fernanda, con los que se puedan, por lo menos para saber quiénes están representados aquí rápidamente. Les invitamos a hacer un acceso, ya que tenemos 2 minutitos, un acceso por Slido para saber qué países y qué representación tuvimos en esta sesión. Nuevamente, muchas gracias a todos por sus contribuciones, a los panelistas, a los coordinadores, a la presidencia de la sesión. Quedamos pendientes para la sesión del viernes. Y Fernanda, te damos la palabra para conducir, terminando ya la sesión de Slido para identificar nuestros participantes. Muchas gracias a todos.
Claro, gracias José Luis. Bueno, rápidamente entonces en un minuto vamos a hacer una caracterización de audiencia. Creo todos ustedes tienen sus máquinas fotográficas, ¿no? Que hoy día igual utilizamos para hacer llamadas. Pueden con sus teléfonos utilizar la cámara en el QR code, no sé cómo se dice eso en español, y contestar las preguntas que aparecen a ustedes. Y vamos a ver de dónde estamos, cuál es nuestra muestra aquí hoy. Son 4 preguntas que ustedes contestan. A medida que contestan, vamos a viendo de dónde son. De qué tipo de institución trabajan ustedes. Si han participado en la última conferencia en El Salvador, el año 2018. En cuántas de las 9 conferencias que ya hemos participado, ustedes, los que están aquí presentes, han participado. Vemos un gran interés en las últimas conferencias.
Bueno, y tenemos una